is my honor to introduce our keynote speaker. Imam Khalid Latif is the Executive Director and Chaplain for the Islamic Center at New York University. In 2005, Imam Latif was appointed the first Muslim chaplain at NYU. At NYU, he initiated his vision for a pluralistic American Muslim community rooted in campus and reaching out to the city. In 2006, the Imam was appointed first Muslim chaplain at Princeton University. In 2007, his position was fully institutionalized at New York University, and so he committed himself to that institution and the building of a Muslim life institution. His exceptional dedication and ability to cross faith and cultural boundaries on a daily basis brought him recognition throughout the city, so much so that in 2007, Mayor Michael Bloomberg nominated him to become the youngest chaplain in the history of the New York City Police Department. He was 24. Since then, Imam has dedicated himself to America's largest police department and has developed tremendously valuable skills as a spokesperson for coexistence, mutual understanding, and productive relationships between cultures, communities, and religions. Please help me welcome Imam Khalid Latif.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillah walhamdulillah wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. In hearing an introduction that goes back about 10, 11 years, it takes me back to parts of my life that I'm still getting accustomed to thinking took place a decade ago. And just to give you an understanding of where my mind is at, my father had a very severe stroke some weeks ago. Alhamdulillah, he's recovering quite well. And they're very optimistic about where his rehab will take him. But just so you know where it is that I'm coming from, those two things are kind of interjecting themselves in my thoughts at this moment. When I was younger, my father, speaking of Princeton University, as was mentioned in my bio, came with me once to visit my school guidance counselor, who was also the headmaster of our school. I went to a small prep school in New Jersey called Wardlaw Hartridge. My college guidance counselor, who was also the headmaster, he and I were talking about schools that I might get into after I graduated from high school, and I really wanted to go to New York University, where I serve as the university's chaplain now. And while we were discussing this, he said that you likely could get into NYU, you might want to think about applying to some other schools as well. And in the middle of our conversation, my father, in true South Asian doctor form, said that my son is going to Princeton. And the headmaster had no idea what to say. And he looked at me, and I didn't say anything. I just kind of smirked because I wanted to see what would happen next. And he said, "You know, sir, Princeton is a really good school, and your son might have a shot at getting in there, but he's a stronger candidate for these other places." My father very definitively said, "No, he's going to Princeton." I didn't end up going to Princeton as a student, but eventually I started to work there. It was really crazy when I was working at Princeton University. I was about 24 years old, and in that first week, I was meeting people that just boggled my mind. Cornel West was at Princeton around that time. Toni Morrison was at Princeton. The founder of Amazon was there for some reason. The person who was responsible for the resurgence of China's economy. And I wondered, what was I doing there? And then after that first week, I started to get letters from alumni at Princeton that said, we don't want Muslims at Princeton. We don't want your Sharia law at Princeton. You don't belong at Princeton. One guy sent me a 400-page book that he wrote, saying that this explains why someone like you should never be at a place like this. Read it so that you understand. I said, I'm not reading your book, man. And then when I sat down with the administration to try to understand how to respond to any of this, simultaneous to my hiring, they had vacated the dean of religious life, the head of the chapel, who was an amazing man that went on to be the Archbishop of Southern Ohio. And the way they explained it to me was, those alumni that got upset thought that we had hired you for that position, not the position that you're actually in. And I said, that doesn't make it any better. That's actually a lot worse. And what you have to understand is, at a place like Princeton, people have a lot of pride. At the end of the year, they do something called a P-Raid, where everybody dresses up in the school's colors, black and orange and white pinstripe suits. And they have this parade of alumni, from the oldest leading the youngest. And you see decades and decades and decades of people pass. And pretty much for a long period of time, they're all just elderly white men. Eventually, you see a little bit of a sprinkle of color, maybe a woman here and there, but by the end of it, even the most recent of alums are still white men. I spent 1 year there. And at the end of that year, just like at universities all over the country, there was a graduation ceremony that took place that wasn't official but was so important, called the Pan-African Baccalaureate Ceremony. That was for minority students, but in large part African-American, black identifying students, to celebrate their graduation from Princeton University. And the young woman who spoke as the valedictorian of that ceremony, where I was asked to also speak, when she got on the mic, she said to her peers that just because we are at Princeton does not mean we are of Princeton. And we should never forget what it took for so many and the struggles they had to endure so that we could be in the places we are today. And our movement forward from this place should not be for individual gains or the service of anything that is egocentric, but we will take what it is that we have access in terms of training, skills, credentials, and utilize them for the advancement of our community on a whole. And why I want to start our conversation there is because you have to understand why CAIR is so important. Because it's not just combating discrimination that we see in a present moment that has existed just post an election cycle a year ago, or even 3 or 4 cycles ago. But it's combating a deeply entrenched racism and bigotry that finds its presence in pretty much every institution that this country is built upon. That's not about an aura of hopelessness, unless you let it be, but a recognition of our ability to uniquely, with a certain audacity and ever-increasing boldness, to challenge the ridiculousness of this racism that is so undeniable that if you can't see it now, I don't know what you're looking at. To break it down, we have to know what it is in the first place. and to match it not just with individuals, but institutions that can see that systems and structures necessitate opposition that is also rooted in systems and structures of their own. That what we're dealing with is not a mechanism that says that I walked down the street and somebody looked at me a certain way, or I walked down the street and somebody called me a bad name, or I walked down the street and somebody told me something that made me feel bad. That's not right. And if you've experienced that, I'm sorry that you go through it. What I'm talking about is a deeply entrenched anti-blackness. That the supremacist ideologies that are heavily prevalent in our country, that tell all of us who are in this room that we will never be the norm, but we will constantly be compared to it, is what it is that CAIR is fighting against. And to go full circle is not that we've just ended in a place where there's no gains, but to understand each and every day that we are blessed to be, and every tomorrow that we are given more breaths to continue on, where there are individuals who will be motivated by their greed, their selfishness, their myopic bigotry. We, you and I, will be the purveyors of real compassion, courage, love, hope, and truth. You got to start looking from here, because the conversation about how to engage the external necessitates understanding that how we process what's around us is going to be the pivotal variable that then compels us to move the body that our heart beats deeply within. That your organs of sensory perception, they are not limited to the eyes that you see with, or the hands that you touch with, the minds that you think with, the ears that you hear with, the tongues that you taste with. But you have a primary organ of cognition that is that heart, that through which all of those senses sends information and it synthesizes and gives you perspectives. Do you get what I'm saying? You have no idea what I'm saying. I'll give you an example of what I mean. I took a few of my students to MIT with me, where I was invited to give a lecture. There was about 500 or 600 people in the audience, and after, a lot of people came up to me and said, that was really inspirational, very charismatic. And then a young woman came up to me and she said, my sister's a big fan of yours. Can I introduce her to you? And I said, sure. And she walked arm in arm, leading her sister all the way to where I was standing, because her sister was blind, she couldn't see. And we had a very brief conversation, exchanged some pleasantries back and forth, and as we wrapped up, this blind woman who couldn't see, she said to me, you know, I thought you'd be a lot taller. I said, what? She said, your voice is not coming from up here, it's coming from down here. I said, oh. And one of my students who was with me, he said, wow, subhanAllah, isn't that amazing? She's blind and she can tell how short you are. And outside I said, oh yeah, that's so remarkable. But inside I was thinking, man, how short am I? A blind woman just told me I'm short. She didn't need eyes to see. Do you understand? And sometimes we take the most simplistic of perspectives because all we see is what we see. And some of us in this room right now, what we see is just the last year. And what I'm asking you, my brothers and sisters, is to dig deep and to see beyond that. To not just look at the realities that are realities, and they don't have to be absolute realities, because we possess what it is necessary to change them. But if you get stuck in a space where you believe that it's something that's only taken place and transpired in the last month, the last year, the last decade, then you're just dealing with symptoms and you're not really addressing the deeper ailments. The supremacy that we talk about, that we all have to not be uncomfortable in being able to deal with and acknowledge so that we can break it down, is something that is not identified and manifested in any individual or organization. In our minds, we get to a place where we associate it with the Spencers and the Dukes. We talk about it in terms of the KKK. And I'm not saying that those aren't things, but it's more of a mindset that you have to understand. That it says whiteness is the primordial state, and it pits everything against it. And on that spectrum, you have whiteness and blackness, and it tells you, whether you are conscious of it or not, that every part of you should aspire towards getting to this end no matter what. You're going to be brown regardless of how hard you try to not be brown. And the sense of self that it takes away from us and what it imposes upon us is that even if we don't ever get to a place where we can actually reach that state of whiteness, it instills within our consciousness that we don't ever want to be black. That the society becomes so stratified since its onset that the aspiration that brought people to this space that was a land of immigrants was uniquely in contradiction to the European context through which people left from. That when people came here and they said that we would embrace diversity, and literal crusades and transatlantic slave trades were being launched in the name of faith across the sea. And people then embraced secularism and liberalism in a way that said that spirituality and faith have no place in this society. This country did not fight its worst battles and wars in the name of any religion or system of faith, but it fought its worst battles, its civil war, over race. The foundational documents of this land afforded full privilege to white males. Women were given nothing. And black men and women weren't even considered to be a whole person in comparison to their white counterparts. And you see this reality in existence throughout, where racism isn't just somebody looked at me and told me that I need to go back to where I came from. But as a system, it gives inherent advantage to one group over everyone else. To understand how that fear gets constructed and where it's rooted in those notions that we are seeking to break down, you have to see how it is that you might not be aware of your own succumbing and becoming subservient to it. And it's hard, because you just get tired of all the same questions over and over. Do you really have to wear that thing on your head? Do you wear it when you go to sleep? Do you wear it in the shower? You can't drink any water when you fast? Not even a little bit? I took 20 of my students with me to have lunch one day at a street cart near our center at NYU. And while we were waiting for our food, there's a middle-aged Caucasian woman standing behind our group, pushing her way through the line, saying, "Excuse me, excuse me, excuse me, can't you understand what I'm saying? I'm trying to order my food." And then she looks at me face to face and she says, "Oh, I guess you can't understand what I'm saying. Tell me, how do they say excuse me where you come from?" I said, "We say excuse me." She said, No, where your family is from, how do they say excuse me there?" I said, "We're from Jersey and we say excuse me." She couldn't understand how somebody that looks like this is actually from the same place that she is. And that mindset in and of itself is beyond problematic. And you know as well as I do that you deal with it as much as I do day in and day out. that people will constantly say to you that everything that you do has a reason to it. That all of your norms and all of your traditions and all of your customs and all of your cultures are things that come from someplace else. But there are some people, whether they're in the United States of America or they're in Canada or New Zealand or Australia or wherever they are in Europe, they're exactly where they're supposed to be. And nobody's ever saying, well, how did you end up where you are? Our histories have colonization in it. Our histories have slavery in it. Our histories have the realities of imperialism in it. But what supremacy does is that it gets into your head and it lets you believe that you are thinking things that you think you are thinking. But in reality, the thoughts that you think are not thoughts that are your own, but they're coming from a place that have been imposed upon you. And what you want to be able to break through, and what CAIR enables us to do, is to not be in a space where we limit ourselves to a thinking that our captivation is just merely a captivation of the physical, but tells us that at no means ever should we allow anyone to take hold of our hearts and our consciousness. And the work that they enable us to be able to do day in and day out, so that we don't have to deal with iniquitous systems for the long term, so that we don't have to deal with harsh realities that are, again, just symptomatic of a deeply entrenched illness that this country has to address so that we can collectively heal. And I would say to you, my brothers and sisters, don't ever become people who buy into the fallacy that speaking out against injustice is somehow an un-American thing to do. Because your alliance and your loyalties do not have to be towards any apparatus or administration that promotes and pushes injustice and inequity in any capacity. And that framing that exists that tells you that here is a good Muslim and here is a bad Muslim is the same as a good minority and bad minority of any kind. And what it is telling you is that your goodness is tied to your silence. And sometimes our speech is about amplifying the voices that are going out and saying the words that we struggle to say for ourselves. Sometimes our role is to be able to find the courage to not be so attached to what is really in the immediate and a gain of not anything, but to think about how no one else will build for us what we have to build for ourselves. And to not allow for us to have generations that come and they're having the same exact conversation, but we dig deep and we hurt to the point that we give and give and give so that with real strength, we build the structures and systems to protect our communities in the ways that we need to, because who else is going to do it for us? And I say this to you as somebody who has shared stages with people like Pope Francis and the Dalai Lama. I've been interviewed by Stephen Colbert and Katie Couric a bunch of times, been on the cover of Newsweek magazine. I've still had the FBI up in my house. After they've come a few times and I've said to them, what do you want from me? They say, you're just too good to be true. Know that we're watching you. Getting on and off of planes is not a fun experience. The realities of being detained, profiled, surveilled, I could tell you in deep detail. I still couldn't tell you what it's like to be a black person living in this country. And I say to you, coming from a place of love, if it is not a Muslim civil rights organization that's combating the ugliness that is racism and bigotry, then what kind of Islam are we practicing? And if we as Muslims are not pouring everything we can to ensure that real beauty prevails, and that our hearts become so abhorrent towards this vile filth that is bigotry. And it's on this place of following this pattern of being state-sanctioned. Centuries ago, when black people were brought here as slaves, it created a system that said, you are second in that hierarchy. And slavery moved to a different sphere of creating those systems by interjecting Jim Crow into the system. And in your state, there are Jim Crow laws on the books as recent as the late 1950s. And then when Jim Crow started to get challenged and people couldn't enact policies, like just read it, type into your phone, Jim Crow, Oklahoma, and read what kind of things people were legislating against black people in your cities. Because the apparatus is built upon that. It didn't just disappear. It's literally the foundation. They then created mass incarceration as a way to then say, black people are still second class. Love has to be the answer to this. Not a fluffy love, not an uncomfortable love, but a real love. A love that in our tradition we are taught is conditional upon the completion of our faith. That the premise and the prophetic narrations come in many different forms, that you will not enter paradise until you believe. And in one narration following this, the Prophet ﷺ says, you will not believe until you love one another. You will not enter paradise until you believe, and you will not believe until you love for your brother what you love for yourself. Imam Nawawi rahimahullah, he says that the word brother in that hadith is not in reference to your brother in faith, but your brother in humanity. That hub, that muhabba, that love has to come from inside. The Arabic language is so deep, it's so rich. There's about a dozen ways you could say love, and so the meaning, it gets lost in its nuance when we translate. Hub, muhabba, has the same root in Arabic as the word for seed, habba. And the relationship between hub, which is love, and habba, which is a seed, is that you can take that love from your heart and plant it as many hearts as you want to. But in order for it to really gain and cultivate anything, it needs attention and care. You can't just throw seeds in the dirt and expect them to yield you something. And the beauty of a seed that's paid attention to is it's going to always give you more than a seed just back. You can't love somebody if you don't spend time with them. And it can't be gatherings that are just like this that bring us together in certain ways. The prophetic voices of this country that said that darkness that is prevalent can only be illuminated with a real light of love requires us to break out of our comfort zones and take advantage of a space like this and have the courage to go and speak to somebody who we could fully get away with never talking to, but knowing that our futures will be different when we actually start it. That if you are brown and you start letting black people into your gatherings, you don't have qualms that being in a place where your child says, I want to marry somebody out of my class, out of my race. That when Ramadan comes in just weeks, and may Allah allow for us to reach it and benefit from it, your iftar dinners are not just the same people as your country of origin or your culture, or they have the same amount of wealth, but you understand that true gatherings of the divine are based off of principles of inclusivity, not exclusivity. And you don't start to decide who it is that you keep out because you're worried what people will think. Because who cares about what those people think? They're not even thinking about you that much in the first place. And you find strength in the numbers that you have. And you break down every shackle of this foolish ignorance and arrogance that is racism. You take the best of everything your beautiful community has to offer, and you go forward and you set a standard that's different. But it comes from a place of real love, and that love has to start from here. How you know you have it is that when you hear about one of our black brothers and sisters getting shot in the street, every part of you starts to ache. How you know that you have it is that when you hear about DACA recipients being violated in their rights, that you start sleeping less at night. How you know that you have it is that when literal pipelines are leaking oil through the lands of true indigenous populations of this country, no part of you can be still. That's how you know when you have real love for others, you love for your brother what you love for yourself. And you take it just one step at a time. Make sure tonight you do not leave this place without supporting the good work that CAIR is doing in Oklahoma. If you've already given and you think you can give more, then give more. The purpose of religion is to not sit perched upon a prism of cultural hegemony that looks at others and takes them into account in assessment based off of your own relative understanding of what is moral and ethical. But the purpose of good religion is to take on societal ills. And there is no deeper and greater ailment right now in this world than racism. And if your Islam is not allowing for you to do that, then at least empower those who are doing it on our behalf. Where you can, be an advocate for this organization. And change will come because we will not be afraid to any longer change ourselves. We will remember who our teachers are and not take lesson from those who seek to serve no interest other than their own self-interest. And I will say it to you one last time as I finish. Anti-Muslim sentiment in this country is just symptomatic of a deeply entrenched anti-blackness. You don't have to believe it for it to be true, but it is the reality. And if we can come to a space where we recognize that we share that much more than what it is that is different that keeps us apart, and we hate to embody any of that ugly racism that is pushing down so many of us, there will be nobody that can hold us down. And I would say this to you, you hear that adhan, we are taught that the adhan is called in moments of truth. So listen from here, and don't let anything into this that has even a mustard seed of that racist arrogance. And my request to you is that I see real beauty in front of me. So once you've given to CAIR tonight, make a commitment now that you will cross this room and find a table of people that you have no idea who their names are. And you will look at them and you will say, my brother, my sister, it is great to meet you tonight. And I hope that this is the first night of many nights that I will be blessed to be in your presence. And I'm so sorry that we have shared space for so long and it has taken me this much time to come and introduce myself to you. It might feel weird in the beginning, but you'll get used to it. And then you'll start to set what is the norm. And you'll live that compassion, that love, that mercy, that hope that this country and this entire world is surely in need of. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide us and protect us. May He bless us with knowledge that benefits us. May He bless us with the tawfiq to understand and implement that knowledge into our daily lives. And may He guide and bless us all. Wallahu ta'ala alam wa billahi tawfiq. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.